Hello everyone, my name is Jason Linardi and welcome to my individual presentation. Today, the topic we will be covering is adaptation. So let's move on to the first slide. So, what exactly is adaptation? From my understanding, adaptation is the process of transforming a literary work from one medium into a different medium. In adaptation, the main themes, storylines, or characters of the original material are reimagined to fit the constraints of the new format. Adapting a literary work is not merely copying or repeating the original. No, an adaptation requires certain modifications or changes because different mediums have their own constraints or limitations, such as time, visual, and, of course, audiences' expectations. Now, in the process of adapting a literary work, the contents of the original can either be condensed or extended, depending on the runtime requirements, and certain storylines or plot points may be omitted or even replaced with new ones. Certain character developments or screen times may be adjusted to fit the pacing of the new medium. Also, an adaptation can also shift the focus on different aspects of the original. And therefore, an adaptation of a literary work is not the same as the source material. No, instead, it is a new creative work with its own charm, visual style, and thematic focus. Also, the process of adaptation has been around for centuries, and it comes in various different forms. Since our focus today is the transference of written literary mediums to films, there's novel to film adaptation, or the process of it, which is called equalization, and this one is quite popular. There are some notable examples of novel to film adaptation, such as The Lord of the Rings film series, The Wizard of Oz, Hamlet, and Little Women. And then there's the reverse version of this, which is film to novel adaptation. For example, the Star Wars novel series, which act as an extension of the original film series. And then there's also game to film adaptation, comic to film adaptation, which we will explore later, and of course, televisual adaptation, where an original source is adapted into a television show. For example, HBO's Game of Thrones TV series, which adapted the A Song of Ice and Fire novels by George R. R. Martin. Next. So, there are fallacies or flawed assumptions that can affect the way we compare source texts to their adaptations. And there's one common fallacy that says faithfulness is the most important aspect in analyzing adaptations. So, this fallacy suggests that an adaptation can only be considered valid or good if it follows the original source material with high accuracy, that it must be a terrible adaptation if it deviates too far from the original. Now, this reasoning is actually flawed and incorrect or untrue because an effective adaptation is not a direct replication of the original. No, instead, it preserves the spirit of the original while adding something new to the story. Also, certain changes can even strengthen the core messages by improving the original's thematic points to be more relevant in the current times. It can also expand the narrative by elaborating some story arcs that are previously not explored enough in the original, or adding some new character developments to certain characters that are underdeveloped in the original. And then these changes can potentially make the story feel more complex and layered than the original source. So, no, an adaptation does not need to be strictly accurate to the original to be considered successful, as long as it can bring something meaningful to the story and convey the core messages effectively to the audience. It is considered a valid adaptation. Now, I would like to explore one type of adaptation that is arguably just as relevant as novel to film adaptation, especially in recent times. And one such adaptation is the comic to film adaptation. As the name suggests, it is a reinterpretation process of a comic book narrative into a film format. Now, this adaptation type is closely connected to filmmaking since the relationship between comics and films can be traced back to their early days as mass distributed media meant to make a profit. Now, both films and comics need the audience to pay attention to the story, and the main difference between them is control. For example, filmmakers set the pace of the film. Um, so, yeah, and while comic readers control the speed pace through reading. Now, comics can also show complex ideas in a single visual image that will take many words to explain in a book or a novel. So, filmmakers must adjust this visual density in a way that captures key elements from the comics properly while keeping the storytelling aspects strong. And that is not the only important thing, since reinterpretations will inevitably create changes. So filmmakers must first have a good understanding of the source comic material before adapting it. Also, there are three approaches when it comes to adapting a comic series into a film. The first approach is type 1, and the purpose of this adaptation model is to create an adaptation that is as accurate to the source comic material as possible. This method usually preserves the original's plot lines, the characters, and even the aesthetic comic styles with little to no alterations. In this type of adaptation, the original source is usually used in the creative process as the storyboard to ensure maximum fidelity, faithfulness. And then the second type is type 2, which is a model of adaptation that focuses on portraying certain representational elements of the original, such as plot, characters, and most importantly, the themes. So, type 2 adaptation method doesn't try to adapt a singular specific comic book storyline. Instead, it combines several story arcs and includes the main themes as a distinguishing factor that makes it recognizable for the audiences. And then there's type 3 approach where certain basic elements like superheroes, villains, and settings are taken from the original while the rest are discarded to varying degree. So, for example, the characters of a comic series are, of course, retained, but the plot, settings, and conflicts will be replaced or rewritten by the filmmakers. Therefore, these changes may alter the tone and the themes of the source comic, of the narrative as a whole. Now, of course, there are many comic book adaptation films, and they're usually adaptations from popular franchises such as Marvel or DC Comics, where the storylines of well known superheroes like Spider Man, Batman, or Captain America are adapted into the silver screen. And one notable example of a comic book adaptation film is the 2009 superhero film Watchmen by director Zack Snyder. Now, I'd like to review this movie for a bit because this is one of the most unique comic book adaptation films, and it is quite distinct from most superhero films. In fact, this film is considered a deconstruction of the superhero film genre. It portrays the superheroes and their struggles in grittier, more realistic scenarios. So, plot summary: the film is about a group of retired American superheroes in an alternate history of 1985, and they face a new conspiracy that threatens the world in the middle of the Cold War, where the threat of nuclear apocalypse is looming in the horizon. And in comic to film adaptation, this film falls into the category of the Type 1 adaptation because it faithfully recaptures the plot, the characters, and even the mise en scene of the comic series. For instance, the characters are portrayed with almost the exact same appearances, physical appearances, and personalities as their comic counterparts. The plot is also the same as the comic version, and visually it is very accurate to the comic. The artwork, the settings, the scenes, they're all closely captured in the film version down to the last minute detail. And so, The original comic book version is a deconstruction or a critique of the superhero genre, and since the film is an extremely faithful adaptation, uh, the film version also follows this notion by becoming a deconstruction of superhero villains. And then there are some things that I'd like to discuss regarding the film's portrayals of certain themes in it. So, the director, Zack Snyder, is famous for his slow motion style filmmaking, and this film utilizes this technique in many of its fighting scenes, emotional moments, and monologues. Now, this creates highly aesthetic takes that enhance the scene visually. So, in short, it makes the scenes look epic and visually pleasing. But here's the thing: there are some visceral scenes, brutal scenes in the movie, like the interrogation scenes, death scenes, or fighting scenes that use choreographed close-up framing slow motion shots. And personally, I think this technical part of the film doesn't convey the theme strongly, since the main point of the film is that superheroes can be flawed. They are often dangerous and violent individuals under realistic circumstances. At least that's the core theme of the whole narrative. They live a very sad, very messy life. And the film somewhat tried to capture this by showing the boring and even depressing lives of retired superheroes. But personally, I think some of the brutal scenes are over choreographed and over stylized to the point of making the supposed violent and sad characters look cool. Characters like Rorschach or the comedian in the film. And I think it glamorizes the superhero life. And considering the film's themes of moral ambiguity and the dangers of vigilantism, unchecked heroism, it just feels less effective in portraying the depravity of the superhero world. But that aside, the slow motion shots do make the film feel aesthetically pleasing, and if the goal is to make the film as visually enjoyable as possible, I think this style works well for the film. So, yeah, that's my brief take on the film. So, in conclusion, adaptation is a transformative process of transferring the foundational elements of a literary work from one medium to another. It is a reinterpretation attempt that preserves and modifies the central narrative parts, such as themes, plot, and characters of the original literary work, which results in a new and independent creative work of art that can be re-experienced in a different medium. Also, comic to film adaptation is a part of this, which is a unique process of reimagining a comic book narrative as a film. Now, adapting comics into films can sometimes be tricky since transferring certain comic elements into another visual medium requires careful consideration of the plot lines, mise en scene, themes, and the narrative structure as a whole. Now, this shows that adaptation is not simply retelling or recreating the source. It is a complex creative process that involves adding new meaningful elements and translating the core ideas and language of a written literary work properly into a visual auditory medium that audiences can experience differently. And that marks the end of my presentation today. I hope this presentation offers some deeper insights regarding adaptation, and I'll see you again next time. Have a good one, everyone.